Good evening. My name's Dave Kaplan. I'm really surrounded by a wonderful group of gentlemen who have written for the New York Times at some point in their distinguished careers. And that's what we're here to talk about, a little bit about the New York Times and about Yogi and what their remembrances are of him. And we'd love to hear some of your comments and questions as well. It's funny, we're setting up for television. These three gentlemen are probably the least telegenic of all. Most sports columnists can't wait to get on television. They can't wait to be on radio. I think, Dave, you said they're like actors, right? They're just,
carnival barkers.
But these guys, I think what I've always loved about George, Harvey, and Dave is that the story, the commentary, the written word is the thing that matters the most. And they've written some eloquent words about sports in this town for many, many years, and certainly they've all known Yogi at different parts of his life. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dave Anderson, Harvey Arreton, and George Vesey. Give them a nice round of applause.
How are you?
Dave was telling us earlier that he was at the Brooklyn Eagle back in 1952 when he first met Yogi Berra. And Dave, the media landscape was slightly different back then. No 24-hour news, there was no ESPN,
no tweets in those
no
years.
tweets.
There were no computers either.
Exactly,
To
no.
send your story in, you needed a Western Union operator doing Morse code. Seriously.
No talk radio, obviously.
Oh, no, that was still 30 years away.
So the written word, the newspaper stories of the Yankees and the Dodgers and the Giants was just very big.
Well, that was it. The newspapers were everything because there was no. I remember Stan Lomax, if anybody remembers that name. He had a radio show at 6:45 every night, but he would just give you the scores. And then the only other radio sports was Red Barber, Mel Allen, baseball play-by-play. And then a little bit after that, there was in the late 40s, I think, there was a show on WHN at the time, I think it was, Glickman, Goldspan, and Lee. Remember? Marty Glickman, Goldspan.
Bud Greenspan, yeah.
Greenspan, and Lee, Bert Lee, but that was it. I mean, and if you didn't, there were no tape recorders either, so you couldn't tape it and save it for a day.
And television was in its very early years. So
everything was black and white on a screen about this big. Yeah.
So how do people how do images and things formed about certain ball players, about...
From the game, play-by-play announcers and the newspapers. That was it.
Do you have a recollection of your first encounters with Yogi? Must have been World Series?
No, well, I was around the Yankees in 1952. I had joined the Brooklyn Eagle as a clerk for $40 a week out of college. And I thought that was a pretty good job, actually. And it was at the time for a kid out of college. And the sports editor, Lou Ness, the next year, he said, I want you to cover the Giants and the Yankees at home. Not every game, but when you're free. And so I would go to some Giant games and some Yankee games. And I really have no particular memory of talking to Yogi, but I mean, all the players were there, and there were only if there were 10 writers at a game, that was it. That was a lot. And there'd be one or two at the most from each paper. Today, you go to a July game against the worst team in the league at Yankee Stadium, and there's, 50, 60, 100 media people? It's big difference.
Well, to that point, George came to the Times from Newsday. I think George came in about 1968, late 60s.
Exactly.
But just fast forwarding a little bit, you talked about what it's like right now. I think George has two of the great descriptions of the way the media is today, and he describes guys who do blogs, in their basement as the underwear guys, and also the people who are tweeting all the time in the locker room, the thumb people. And it wasn't like that when you were covering sports and growing up during the 50s and 60s, George, and this was really the golden age of baseball in New York City. So you were a Brooklyn Dodger fan. What are some of your recollections of watching baseball back in those days?
Well, having 3 teams in town, you'd get newspapers would come out. The News and the Mirror would come out at 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. You'd wait, come off the truck, and you'd buy one. And of course, for guys of a certain age, we remember the expression, you go home with the News and the Mirror, which meant you hadn't had a very successful social evening. But at least you'd had the box scores. That's when even the New York Times ran box scores in those days, but don't quote me. And you had it all over town. I mean, the noise, the radios, you'd hear them at the beach. You'd hear, the day Joe DiMaggio came back from his heel injury in 1949, I can remember being at the beach. I was, 10 years old, and everywhere was Mel Allen. And I don't mean to say, I don't, he was going on and on about this injury, and it was everywhere. It was more pervasive, perhaps, because there was less of it, so you'd hear the echo of the same voices. But I will tell you about the first time I met Yogi. I can remember. Dave undoubtedly had all good memories, but I was a 20-year-old just about to graduate from Hofstra in 1960, and Jack Mann sent me up to do a day Yankee game, and like a good chipmunk asking a lot of hard questions reporter, I framed a 3-part question before the game. And I went up to Yogi and I said, well, sir, if this is true, then that must be true. And so therefore, and Yogi said, how the hell would I know? And, it stayed with me. And I watched him, though, over the years of, he knew the guys from New York, he knew the guys from New Jersey. I was a Long Island guy, and it wasn't so much. He knew the inner circle. He knew the people he knew. He was a person of some suspicion and also trust in the people that he knew. And it took a long time. I watched him over the years show his weaknesses, his foibles, even not wanting to play in '65 when Casey brought him to the Mets, and he didn't want to play. He told a friend of mine, Bill Wakefield, who was a pitcher, he said, Wake, I can't catch curveballs, and so take it easy on me. This was in batting practice or whatever. He didn't want to have that thing on anymore. So I got to see him, and fast forward 50 years, early in the 2000s, when Harvey was his buddy in spring training and all of that, I remember wandering into the Yankee clubhouse and seeing these giant 6'8" players wandering around, and Yogi, who was getting tinier, he came out of the locker room, out of the shower room, wherever he was, padding around, a little guy, and he didn't I don't know that he knew many of them. Obviously he knew Jeter and so on, but he recognized me. I'd been around long enough, and he came up to me and said, how's it going, Steve? Because maybe he called Steve Jacobs and George. But the point being that I'd been around long enough that I was finally in Yogi's inner circle for reporters hanging around the locker room. But it only took 50 years.
Harvey, you've seen a big change in the business as a young reporter in the 70s, and you were there part of that whole crazy Yankee Bronx Zoo back in the late 70s when Yogi was sort of a coach and sort of in the background in a way. But do you have any recollections, covering the Yankees under Steinbrenner and that tumult with Yogi sort of in the background and not looking to get in the newspaper at all?
Well, first of all, I have to say for the record that wherever I go, I credit George's line, "The thumb people." I heard you say it somewhere, or maybe Philip Bondi told me that you had said it, and I always give you credit for it. But I also do tweet and do all that stuff on my
Gone over to the dark
But
side.
I can't be considered a thumb people because I can't do it with my thumb, so I'm always doing this with my Anyway, I grew up a Yankees fan in Brooklyn and Staten Island, and so my first recollection of Yogi actually is like a 7-year-old kid in the 1960 World Series. Was it 60 World, the Pirates, right?
Right.
Pirates.
And for some reason, I have no memory about baseball before Game 7 of that series. I'm sure I was looking at the TV, but that was my first memory. And I remember we were living in an apartment building in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. And we were in a neighbor's apartment, and there was a lot of excitement. It was a crazy game, that seventh game. And I remember really getting hooked into it and really beginning to understand what was happening in the game. And then all of a sudden, in the bottom of the ninth inning, Bill Mazeroski comes up off Ralph Terry, and it's a home run over Yogi Berra's head, and goes over the left field fence at Forbes Field. And the TV goes off, and that's the end. And I throw an absolute tantrum because it was so exciting, I wanted it to continue. And I carried on to the point where my father took me home and locked me in my room. But that was the beginning of many tantrums when the Yankees would lose, as the rabid fan that I was. But yeah, my career covering New York sports really began sort of in the late 70s, early 80s. I was primarily, my primary beat was covering the Knicks. I was at the tabloids in those days. But during the summers, when the regular beat writers, Henry Hecht and some of the others would take off, they would throw the young guy out on the road with the Yankees. And so I think it was the 78 season, which was the crazy season when the Yankees came from 14 games at a time. In the middle of the season, it was sort of like approaching the All-Star game. The New York Post sent me on the road with the Yankees. And I remember it was a 6-game trip to Texas, where it was like 140 degrees in the shade, and Milwaukee. And everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. I mean, Ron Guidry had like a 13-0 record, and he lost his first game. A rookie second baseman made an error, and a Yankee named, Cliff Johnson, threatened to kill all the reporters if we went near him because he didn't speak English very well. I think it was Damaso Garcia. So all these things are going wrong. Reggie and Billy are at each other's throats during that period. Billy had one game where he might have been a little hungover after the previous night, and it was just a nightmare. And in the middle of all this, as a rookie reporter, I'm trying to figure out, is there anybody here I can talk to who won't kill me if I ask the wrong question? And that person happened to be Yogi. I mean, you could always, George said he was a little guarded, but if you went over just to ask baseball questions, Yogi, what I found out very quickly about Yogi was that he loved to just talk about baseball. So if you were just curious about the games and you didn't get him involved with, Billy and Reggie and all that craziness, then he was happy to talk to you. And I remember having several conversations with Yogi on that trip. It was almost as if I was standing around the clubhouse and I was like, who can I talk to? Where is the safety zone? And it was Yogi's, and those are my first recollections of meeting him personally.
And Dave, you were there, you were at the Times when Yogi was managing the Mets in 1973, and everyone thought he was going to get fired. The Mets were in last place in July. I think the Daily News did a poll, should Yogi be fired? There was a lot of pressure. As a matter of fact, years later, it was kind of interesting. Carmen tells a story. By the way, Lindsay Berra is here. Lindsay, you want to say hello? Okay. When Yogi actually did get fired in 1975, Donald Grant, the Mets owner, called up Carmen and said, Carmen, we're going to have to let Yogi go. We just have to. And Yogi said, and Carmen said, well, you can't do it for another week. And Grant said, why? He goes, because my sister is coming into town, and I don't want her to be upset by anything, so just wait a week. Really true story. They let him go. But in 73, when they were supposed to let him go,
I remember,
tell me about when you...
early that season, Yogi said for the first time, I'm told, it's not over till it's over. But I distinctly remember him, 3 months later, it was August, I think, I was in his office at Shea Stadium, and I distinctly remember him saying, you're not out of it until you're out of it. So he really said these things.
He did say these things, and he said a lot of those things. And
but here he took a team to the World Series, to 7 games against Oakland? And still got fired, not then, but the next season.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. Harvey was talking about the '60 World Series. There's a big controversy in baseball now with the showboating and the over over celebration. But Yogi was a very, very demonstrative player. People, the enduring image obviously is him jumping into Larson's arm, but he always would jump on the pitcher's back after a big World Series win. And during that '60 World Series, Yogi hit the home run that put the Yankees ahead in that game. He thought this was it.
Three-run homer, right?
Pardon? Three-run homer. And as he's running the first base, he was hopping and skipping. It's unbelievable. There's very little footage of it, but he said he was just kind of, trying to wish the ball fair and so forth. But he was a very demonstrative player and played with a lot of emotion, a lot of flair.
Did he hit the ball in the ninth inning that Mantle dove back into first base?
Yes, that was his. I think that was it too, where Mantle made that great base running move. But he just, Dave and George, you saw him as a player. He just. Can you talk a little bit about just his? This is a man who never really had a formal education, and yet Casey Stengel relied so heavily on him to sort of guide the Yankee pitchers through.
Well, he had great baseball instincts. He knew how to play baseball and how his teammates should play baseball. And he could, even with Stengel, and when you mentioned when I first knew Yogi, in those years, after a game, if you were a writer, you went and listened to Stengel for half an hour, and by then the players were gone anyway. But anyway, he could talk baseball, and he was a baseball genius, let's put it that way. It was as simple as that. He may not have been a genius, although he proved to be a genius in many respects. But in those years, Stengel realized he was baseball a genius, and he used to call him my assistant manager. Yeah.
George, you wrote a wonderful biography of Stan Musial. And and you came here a few years ago, and I was so struck by some of the things you learned about Musial, and obviously Yogi and Carmen owe Stan Musial because they met in the restaurant that he owned with a man named Biggie. But can you talk a little bit about just how Stan Musial, in many ways, his life story sort of mirrors Yogi's?
Well, I think they're two of a kind. First of all, in the book, Tim McCarver talks about Musial's luck. Couldn't play poker, but always won in the card games in the back of the team playing because he was just lucky. And it's the same kind of luck, you want to call it luck, that Yogi had of always doing the right thing. Swinging a bad pitch down here and it goes over a distant fence. And they were just, both Garagiola and McCarver have described the two of them as, almost like children of nature, just gifted with some kind of ESP that they could get things right. In Musial's case, he was wise enough to know that he wanted to go into business. Here's a guy from a poor, fairly dysfunctional family in the zinc area, the Donora smog area of Pennsylvania, and he knew when he got to St. Louis that it was the right town for him. He liked it. He fought off trades to leave St. Louis, and he wanted to get into the restaurant business, but he didn't just want to be a front. He wanted to know, so he got involved he could go in, he knew the cuts of steak, and he'd read the Wall Street Journal every day, and he had an office. And this is a man with really not much education and not much pushing him to be better except something from within. I think Yogi was the same way in that the instincts that he had, he's playing golf, doesn't have time to change. He comes into Musial's restaurant in his spikes. He's clumping around in there, and there's a lovely young waitress named Carmen Short, and the rest, as the saying goes, is history. Now, you have to be a genius to run into Carmen and know that she's the right person, because in so many ways I think of the two of them as a pair, just as Musial and his wife were, where the wife was, in some ways maybe you could say the brains or the will or the vision as part of the operation. So I think Yogi's, there was no ultimately, as Casey would say, you make your own luck. And I don't think there was much luck involved with Yogi finding the right path in life. I mean, look at this place. How many ball players have their own museum and learning center in their name, in their town, where they've been, most ball players, they blow it, and, by the time they're out of baseball, and he's the opposite. So I would say he was, in life as in baseball, a genius.
And Harvey, you got to know Yogi, I mean, you were here, right here, the day that he made his piece with George Steinbrenner, and there's I think there's some similarities with Yogi and Musial too. There was a stubbornness, so they're both men of principle. They were both very dignified in their own way too. And obviously Yogi's refusal to go back to the Yankees over the manner in which he was fired by George really brought out that he said, I could be a rockhead sometimes. And he really was a very stubborn man. And you'll attest to that, right, Linz? He was pretty set in his ways? Okay, okay.
Lindsay,
But-
why don't you come down here?
Yeah.
with us?
But Harvey, what struck you about that meeting? They had not seen each other in 14 years. It was just quite an event. The fact that Yogi had agreed to meet George basically on his turf right here to sort of make his
well,
peace.
As the story goes, I mean, even Susan Waldman, who broadcast Yankee games, who had the idea, she was pretty close to George Steinbrenner, and she was the one who sort of pitched George on making a trip up here from Tampa to, in effect, beg Yogi's forgiveness. Yogi, just to clarify, Yogi had been fired as the manager in 1985, very early in the season, after Steinbrenner had more or less promised him that he would be the manager for the entire season. And he did so through an intermediary. The team was in Chicago, and he had, I think it was
Clyde King, yeah.
tell him, Yogi, you're fired. And the thing about Yogi is that what I came to understand, and he had been fired before, obviously, by the Mets and by the Yankees back in the 60s, and he understood that managing was, not a long-term commitment. They always say managers are hired to be fired. So that wasn't what really bothered him, that he actually got fired, even though it was kind of ridiculous that he got fired after, 12 games or something like that?
16. Yeah.
But it was the way it was done. And one thing that Yogi always really believed, what I came to understand, was that that being part of the Yankees, there's sort of an aura to it and a great principle about it. Now, people who do not like the Yankees would probably argue about it, but one thing that Steinbrenner always did was talk about, what it meant to be a Yankee and how Yankees should act. I mean, the Yankees have all these rules about, the players being well groomed and this and that. And in Yogi's mind, how could George, conduct himself that way when he always went on and on about, being the pride of the Yankees and all this. So that was what really wounded him. But I just remember being here and got here a little early, tipped off by Dave. I think the only two reporters were myself and Philip Bondi of the Daily News. We both live in Montclair. And watching Yogi wait for George to come was really very interesting. And I think I wrote in my piece after Yogi passed away that he was sort of like, on the one hand, he looked like a father waiting for a son to come home with a car late at night. And on the other hand, he looked like a little boy who did something wrong and was waiting for his father to come home and discipline him. And Yogi could be like that. I mean, he could be very playful and seem a lot younger than his years, but at the same time, he was also a very proud, serious man. So I just remember the great story is that when George showed up, they hit traffic, it was rush hour, and he showed up a few minutes after 5, he was supposed to be here at 5, and Yogi was a man of, punctuality. And George walked up and said, "Hi, Yogi," and Yogi just looked at his watch and said, "You're late." And it went on from there, and it was just a wonderful night because Susan Waldman also did her radio show out of the museum right in here.
Right here.
Yeah.
And I remember, I believe it was Ted Williams who had called in.
Called in, yeah.
And Garagiola called in. And I remember Susan saying, when I did my book on Yogi and Ron Guidry, that the place was kind of empty when the broadcast began. And that as word filtered that Yogi and George were kissing and making up right on campus in Montclair, people just started to filter in. And she said, we started the show, and the next thing I looked up and the place was jammed. It was just a wonderful, wonderful night. And it was in 1999. I'll just tell one little quick story. My older son was about 9 years old at the time, so 9 and 10 years old. And so when I told him I was coming up here, I said, hey, you want to come up? And he said, yeah, sure. So like most kids that age, he grabbed a baseball. And after Yogi and George stepped into the little office, and George did his apology with Carmen there as well, Yogi gave George a tour of the museum. And so we were all milling about and watching this unfold, and my son goes up to Yogi, who he had met before because he went to school, public school, not too far from here, and they would come up and do programs here. And he went up to Yogi and said, Mr. Berra, will you sign my baseball? And of course, Yogi did. So then my son comes over to me and he says, Dad, Yogi signed my baseball. I said, great. He said, do you think Mr. Steinbrenner would sign it? I said, yeah, I think so. Just don't tell him you're my son. So he goes up and George signs the ball. Now, all these years later, my son has this baseball that has Yogi and George's signature on it on the night they made up. It's an original. I don't think there's any other ball quite like it.
You have it notarized?
I'm the notary.
Oh, yeah.
And my column from the Times the next day. But, I said to my son at one point, as he, graduated from college, needs money. I said, hey, you want me to ask Brandon Steiner what that ball is worth? He said, no, I'll never sell it. And that's his keepsake from that night here.
Great story. I bet some of you might have some questions for George and Harvey and Dave, and I'll start with Lynn.
Me?
Oh, it was Phil. So, actually, Phil Pepe was here, and I guess the Ali Frazier fight of the century.
In the garden. They won in the garden, not in Manila.
Yeah, the Ali Frazier fight in the Garden, 71.
right.
And I guess the job was to get predictions from 100 celebrities, people from all walks of life, all fields of entertainment, and they all give their Frazier in 9, knockout in 15, whatever, and so there's the one guy who got it exactly right, Yogi. Frazier by decision in 15 out of 100 predictions. He just had a knack. Was that the story? Okay. Yeah, it was Phil. James.
Thank you, Dave. This question's for George. George, you hear a lot about the great pitching that the Mets have today, but Yogi was a coach in 69, of course he managed in 73. When the Mets had great pitchers of their own, with Seaver Kuzman, Nolan Ryan at the time, Gary Gentry, even though Rube Walker was the pitching coach then, what was Yogi's interaction as far as enhancing the performances of those great pitchers on the Mets at that time? Do you remember anything in particular?
I don't want to cop out, but I don't remember any particular interplay. Walker had a lot of input to those players, and they really relied on him, as Hodges did too. I couldn't tell you. I mean, Dave may have heard some of the stories, or my colleagues. Lindsay might know. I honestly don't know if there was a lot. I couldn't tell you.
I will tell you, James, it was a very collaborative coaching staff. Yogi said that Gil loved getting input from every coach on it. And that coaching staff was together for a long time. And Yogi kept them together when he took over, when Gil passed away.
To his credit, yeah. He fit right in. That was part of Yogi, is when this terrible thing happens in 72, and he's a manager, but he was as comfortable working for Hodges, you know, as the other guys were for him a few years later. But go ahead. I'd like to hear about the collaborative, you know.
Yeah, no, so actually, I think Yogi was actually the very first bench coach in baseball. He may have been when Billy Martin brought him in 1976. And, you know, he valued that. He valued that expertise and, you know, his opinions on things. I think Billy used to call Yogi my morning newspaper because Billy was usually hungover the night before. And Yogi would tell him what happened, you know, who was hot, who wasn't, and things like that. But he really, he loved coaches. He had wonderful relationships with Don Zimmer, which you chronicled, Harvey, in your book. And, you know, with all the coaches that he's known through the years,
sure. Yogi was the constant. Yogi was always there. The other coaches came and went.
Exactly. So I think it's just he was just a baseball guy who liked to share information and, you know, give his opinions when asked. Anybody else? Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, it was just amazing that Yogi was famous for how few times he struck out as a ball player. And I guess it was 1950 where he struck out.
12 times and 597.
How many?
12 times.
12 times.
597 at best. 656.
Yes, I mean, it was amazing. Runner on third base, less than 2 outs. You could bet the ranch that Yogi was going to get the runner in. But today, strikeouts to the sabermetricians, I guess, is just another out. I don't quite see it that way. You've got a runner on third base with less than 2 outs. Put the bat on the ball. You've got a shot at getting him in. When I see a guy like Brett Gardner is striking out 135 times in one season.
He was very proud of that, the fact that he seldom struck out. He just felt it was a wasted at bat.
Did he learn that from DiMaggio? Because
He did.
DiMaggio hardly struck out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He really looked up to DiMaggio in many ways.
I once heard Frank Robinson say that the great statistic in baseball was, in addition to other things like DiMaggio's streak and all that, was DiMaggio's 369 strikeouts and 361 career homers. And Robinson just shook his head like, how is that possible? But Yogi, and DiMaggio had a strike zone. Yogi had no strike zone. You know, he and Clemente and, you know, a few other great hitters, they would just go where they thought they could hit a ball. It didn't seem to hurt them much.
Dave, somebody sent me a tweet last week. Saturday day at 22, Bryce Harper. So I checked it out, and he was a little bit wrong. Bryce is up by 35. Bryce is 449 years. Wow. That's ridiculous.
You're better, Lindsay, you're better than the Elias Sports Bureau.
Did you use your thumbs?
Okay, so Lindsay, I guess a few years ago, one of your colleagues, Joe, did a big story on Yogi. Who's the? Can you share that great story, Yogi, which says it all about him as a grandfather? I guess years ago, about 7 years ago, there was a big profile done.
They did it for Grandpa's 85th birthday, and Joe LaPointe was a columnist at the Times. And he called me and said, I have to write a story on your grandfather's 85th birthday. Or maybe it was his 80th birthday. I don't remember. Anyway, and he said, you got to tell me a story that no one's ever told before. And I was like, well, geez, no pressure, Joe. Can I think about this or whatever? And he said, just something that you guys interact that just is indicative of how these yogiisms just come out of his mouth, or it's the way he thinks and whatever. And I thought about it, and I don't even know if it happened, and then I called Joe back, but I had been out doing a story on a tennis player. I used to write for ESPN magazine, and I came home, and Grandpa sees the story in the magazine, and I walked into the house one night. I used to go there and eat their leftovers after my soccer games, because that's what grandchildren do. And he's got the magazine open on the counter, and he says, this kid is very handsome. You should date him. And I said, Grandpa, I can't date him. He dates a swimsuit model. And without missing a beat, he goes, you got swimsuits. It was I laugh. I've told it 1,000 times now, and I laugh every time because it's just such a perfect example of how he saw the world. Everything was just so black and white, so practical. I do, in fact, have swimsuits. It's true. And it was just the way his brain was like, well, what's the problem? You know, like right or wrong, black or white, left or right, up or down. There was no gray area for Grandpa. So.
You know, you're the star of this show.
Two things that I remember, the number one that I heard was when Jewel and Mike were teamed up on doing the play-by-play in color. Without hesitation. Yogi could hit a ball that bounced 3 feet in front of the plate and get a double out. Okay? And then the other thing that was phenomenal was Casey's Stengel said we would have never done what we did as a team without Yogi behind the plate.
He played him a lot, and Lindsay and I know the great, another great statistic, how many more catchers will you see catch over 100 doubleheaders in their career? Or Yogi caught.
I met him many times, and especially I used to deliver here. I was amazed how well the man walked, catching all those games.
He always said it was because he was short, he didn't have far to squat.
Nowadays, you look at catchers, they got those wedges behind their knees and everything, the same and everything. This guy walked better than I did, and he's about 30 years older than me.
Back in 1950, 51, Yankees played something like 20 doubleheaders that year. Yogi caught 19 of those doubleheaders. One off, I guess Charles Berra caught that one. But he also caught a doubleheader after they had clinched the pennant.
Well, we have a little story. For Yogi's 90th birthday, Charlie Silvera loved Yogi, and he was so grateful because he was the backup. He never played, he'd get all those World Series shares. And to this day, he calls his house that he's built in the 1950s, the house that Yogi built.
Yes, for the gentleman there. For the public, I go back to the late 60s, remember the miracle Mets and Yogi being with the Mets and all of that, and then managing. Looking at it from a historical point of view, Yogi was, there was a time Yogi was the creation of Casey and Joe Garagiola, and here we are all these years later, and you get a truer sense of who he really was, and I was just wondering his evolution. It was almost like, Casey was the guy, and Joe Garagiola made this guy, created this guy during the game of the week, and his personality and persona, and having had the pleasure and the honor to have met Yogi a couple times and talked with him actually, and he asked him a simple question, as you were all saying, just such a direct, black and white answer. It kind of reminded me of my grandfather. I'm Italian as well, just like, what you thinking about? This is it, I'm like, okay, that makes sense to me. I'm just wondering, how did the process occur, and did you see this process, in your time of covering it?
I think it was important for Yogi, in retrospect, that he got fired after winning the pennant in 1964. I think that firing, everybody realized how unfair it was, and I think that it put Yogi in a different niche, so to speak. But that's just my thought. I don't know.
As far as being a creation, I don't think it hurts to have Joe Garagiola on national radio and television telling stories about you. I don't think it hurt in any way. Did it create Yoo-hoo? Did it create the museum? Did it make him money? All to some degree. It made him more of a lovable character even than we knew. So I guess Joe Garagiola was one of the great PR guys for a friend of his. He was also, in a way, promoting his own, life. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but they came from the same place. They came from the Hill. Their families worked in the same places. And when Joe was honoring Yogi, he was also honoring himself. No, that's not a negative. And the same thing with Casey. Casey, it doesn't hurt to have been, quote, discovered by Casey Stengel, but if Casey had gone around promoting a different brand, if Casey had gone around saying, Marvelous Marv is really a better ball player than you think, or Marvelous Marv is really a smart baseball man, it wouldn't have worked. But in Casey, he let us know who Yogi was and how much, he called him Mr. Berra, and you didn't miss the point that he really did respect him. and the Yogi had said things in the dugout that we would never even know about that would work. I want to add one thing I've forgotten. If I don't say it, I'll forget to say it. In working on the musical book, I had no idea until I called Arlene Howard to say what was it like for Elston coming along in St. Louis. And she said that they went to a baseball dinner one night when Elston was maybe just starting his first year in the major leagues, the first black player with the Yankees. And that Stan Musial had gotten him aside and said, here's what you need to do for contract, here's how you go after him, don't be shy, do this or that. Gave him serious baseball business advice from somebody who had already proved that he knew how to do that. Years later, I found out about Yogi, that when Casey and other people came to him and said, how would you feel about playing some left field and right field, because we've got to get Elston Howard in the lineup, Yogi all for it, all on. And the combination of the two guys being part of it in a probably quiet, non-political, non-controversial way, in a pragmatic way that they understood. I think they're linked in that way too. So it wasn't just luck, it was conscience on both their part, and Elston Howard and his family were aware of it.
I can't really speak to, the origin, of Yogi's character and reputation. Although as a kid I did drink Yoo-Hoo. I did kind of associated with Yogi. But I do think that that George's visit here really launched this great new act for Yogi later in life. And I thought actually it truly benefited both George and Yogi, because when George came here, that was 1999, and so the Yankees were in the midst of their little mini dynasty, and I thought by George coming here, it humanized him and helped him sort of recalibrate his reputation. Remember, as he got to the later stages of his life, people began to look at him a little differently and sort of like say, yeah, we know he fired everybody and tortured everybody, but, look what he did with Yogi, and, then he became a little bit softer. And as far as Yogi goes, I mean, the things that by Yogi sort of becoming part of the Yankees environment again, I mean, how does anyone really explain the fact that his first year, months after George came here, they held a Yogi Berra Day, and they invited Don Larson to come for the event, and what happens? David Cohn throws a perfect game. I mean, it's really kind of inexplicable that actually occurred. So I really do think, and then, from a personal standpoint, I think it was, when did we have that discussion about Ron Guidry and Yogi? About 4 years ago?
2011, yeah.
Yeah. It was a privilege for me to first find out, and the whole relationship between Yogi and Ron Guidry, it was a story in the Times that ran on the front page of the paper. And the way it came about was, Dave, we went out to dinner with our wives, who are really good friends, and we're good friends, and I was heading down to spring training the following week, and that was the year, or the previous year, where Yogi had taken a bad spill outside his home, and he had missed Old Timers Day and going to Cooperstown that year, two of the things that he absolutely loved. And so I just casually asked Dave, is Yogi going to spring training this year? And he said, well, he's going down the week after you're there. And so I was just curious, and I said, look, I know he took that fall, and he's slowing down a bit. Who looks after him? Does Carmen go down with him? And Dave said, no, it's kind of interesting. Ron Guidry kind of looks after Yogi. They have this great friendship, and it's a great generational relationship. And I didn't think really anything of it, I mean, at the moment. And then that night, driving home with my wife, it just like the thought popped into my head. Spring training a pitcher and a catcher. Spring training is all about pitchers and catchers, right? To launch it. And I was like, wow, that would be a great story if I could get, them to talk to me about it. So the next week, before I left for Florida, I came here and spoke to Yogi, and then I talked to Carmen, and then I went down to Florida, and I waited for Ron Guidry to come out of the coach's dressing room. And when he came out, I mean, I kind of knew Ron a little bit, but not that well. And I asked him, I brought it up, I said, I would like to talk to you about your relationship with Yogi. And he said, oh no, that's very private between Yogi and myself. I don't really want to talk about it. My heart kind of sank because I thought it was such a, a nice, warm story. And I said, well, I live in Montclair and I've known Yogi and his family and I talked to Yogi and Carmen about it. And Ron's face just brightened and he said, well, if Yogi talked to you about it, then I'm fine with it too. And he had such great respect for Yogi that if Yogi talked about it, then he was in. And I turned on my recorder and he talked for like an hour. We remember standing there. I remember the stories he was telling about the warmth between the two of them and their little capers, going shopping and going out to dinner. And I got home and wrote the story, and the editors were kind enough to put it on A1 of the paper. And soon after, it turned into a book, which was really, a privilege for me to kind of write that kind of a book about Yogi and open a window into his, the sort of the older part of his life, but also allow him to be seen in this endearing way and this special relationship that he so valued. And so it was just a great experience all around for me.
And if you haven't read that book, buy it, because it's one of the great baseball human books ever.
I read your book. You have to tell the story about the frog's legs.
Oh, yeah.
Frog's
Well,
legs.
Ron Guidry is from Louisiana, from Cajun country, and he fancies himself as a pretty good cook. And his father actually, as well, and came out with some cookbook and with all these recipes and all these Cajun delights. And so, one of the things that Ron would like to do every year going to spring training, where he has been for many years one of the guest spring instructors. They invite a lot of the legendary Yankees back to help out during spring training. So Ron he would actually ship them to Tampa prior to his driving across from Louisiana. And he would ship all these frog's legs, and he would make them. And the other coaches loved them, Mel Stottlemyre, Don Zimmer, and he would bring a batch into the clubhouse once every spring. And so one day he brings them in. Now again, by this point it's well established that Yogi and Ron are constant golfing buddies and dinner companions. I mean, they had a rotation of 5 restaurants. Yogi, being a creature of routine, would insist on the order of the restaurants one after the other until Ron would say, that's it, you stay in your room tonight, I'm getting a burger and that's it. So Ron brings the frog's legs into the coach's room in the clubhouse. And he says to Yogi, Yogi, try this. And Yogi looks at it and makes a face, nah, I'm not eating that. And Ron says to him, no, really, you're really good. And Yogi says, no, I don't like it. And Ron looks at him and says, Yogi, if you don't try this, we're not going out to dinner tonight. So Yogi tries it, and he goes, it's not bad. After that, it became a sort of a ritual of spring, where once every spring training, Ron would have to throw like a frog's legs party. And it was usually like during the NCAA tournament. Yogi loved other sports and really liked college basketball. Really liked women's college basketball as well. But he would throw this party, but only Yogi was allowed to invite people. Only certain people could come to the frog's leg party. And every year, and so Yogi, as he would anticipate going down to spring training, like in December, would call up Ron in Louisiana and say, you got the frog's legs yet? And Ron would say, Yogi, it's December. We're not going down until February. But this became part of Yogi. Yogi was a real creature of routine, and this became part of his annual routine, was to not only, enjoy the Frog Leg Party, but also make sure that Ron wasn't forgetting that there had to be one.
He was slightly regimented, yeah.
You were talking about character before with Yogi, and I was lucky enough to, at 12 or 13 years old, to have been to that day. Luck of meet him. His market in Verona when he went to go pick up the papers every day. And I was told after that. And I've met him quite a few times after that. But you look at Joe, and I met Joe when I was 12 or 13, and here I am now. I meet Yogi in the 1980s, and I'm roughly 30 years old. The two were of the same mold. I mean, maybe because they came from the same, whatever. They were both respectful, and the way they accepted people around. One time, Yogi's son was probably the most lovable thing that I've ever met in my life. And I said to him, with Yogi, all you have to do is give him a greeting and have two sentences with him about anything. And I used to talk golf with him a lot. And you felt like you knew him for most of your life. That's how he made you feel. He was very comfortable to be around.
Well, one thing that George mentioned was about, that is the fact that this place exists. And, having lived here for 22 years now, the one story that pops into my mind is, I think it was maybe a year or two after I moved here, and my in-laws came down. My sons were young. My in-laws came down on, I think it was an October weekend afternoon, and there was a book festival in one of the parks. And so we're walking through, my wife and I and my in-laws and my sons, and my father-in-law, who is about Yogi's age, he's 87 now, stops dead in his tracks. They came down from Connecticut. And he grew up in New York. And he grabs my arm and he says, is that Yogi Berra? And he didn't know that Yogi lived here. And I said, yeah, he lived here. He lives here. Go up and say hello. And he's like, no, I can't. And I said, no, everybody else does. So go up and say hello. And he did. And Yogi talked to him for 15 minutes or so. And for like the next 3 months, he was telling all of his friends. At that point, he was still working as an attorney in Greenwich, Connecticut. For the next 3 months, he was telling everybody who knew in Greenwich that he had met Yogi Berra and what a nice guy he was. He was the most approachable guy.
Oh,
I mean, that's what everybody who I talked to for that book would say the same thing. I mean, there's never been a less pretentious celebrity in the history of sports and maybe entertainment.
You were saying how he loved all sports and what have you. And I used to be a season ticket holder at the Devil games when we used to be at the Meadowlands. And Yogi was there very frequently because he was tight with McMullen. And McMullen's box was almost like right behind from where my seats were. And that's one of the places I used to run into him at least half a dozen times a season for 3 years.
Dave, his favorite second pastime was golf. So,
Yogi.
yeah, he just, and that really kept him going a long, long time. He just felt that as long as he could play golf,
One of the times I ran in here was a beautiful day like it was today, a fall day. And I was working for FedEx, and I was making a delivery, and I'm walking in, and he beats me to the door. He turns around and looks at me, and I said to him, what are you doing here? I said, you should be out playing golf. He says, I played yesterday. So I asked him, I said, how'd you do it? He says, I didn't hit me too well.
Yogi played golf. He would hit off the tee right-handed.
Yeah.
And then putt left-handed. And somebody said, gee, that's crazy. I said, why is it crazy? He used to catch right-handed, but hit left-handed.
Like this a lot lately too. He used to actually, he wasn't so good that he felt like he had to have all 14 clubs, like he could sacrifice one. He used to carry one wedge or iron or something. That way, he'd never have a bad lie. If he was up against a tree, he would hit it from the other side. So,
Good move.
he's smart.
Another part of Yogi's genius.
It's like a Boy Scout.
Okay, good.
The MLB Network this past summer before the induction ceremony. Bob Costas was interviewing and one of them was Craig Biggio. And in the course of the conversation, he was talking about his days as coming up to second base. And totally unsolicited, he said, you know, Yogi was the smartest baseball man I ever met. Kind of a little like that, so he carried a lot of weight.
Frank Hillian was interviewing him and the interview went for about half hour, 45 minutes. The last questions he asked Yogi, he says, you played with this guy, that guy, Joe DiMaggio, Ricky Mann, who would be your most valuable player all the years that you were involved in baseball? Without hesitation, he said, Carmine, the first one. I thought that was such an admirable answer.
So many of you probably picked up the book by the Times, and that's been edited by Dave Anderson. And Dave, there was quite a process going through a lot of the old stories and
The book
photos.
consists basically of
Yeah.
New York Times articles on Yogi throughout his career. So,
And
It's a
some great
beautiful
names,
book.
some of your old colleagues.
well, there's old names in there that probably only I and maybe George and Harvey remember. Roscoe McGowan, who covered the Brooklyn Dodgers for the Times, but also wrote about Yogi. John Drebinger, who covered the Yankees for decades. Arthur Daly, all those old Times writers. We're the young Times writers, as you can see.
But he always had a very good relationship with the writers. He always
did,
treated everybody
yeah.
well, and I think in even some of those early biographies, I think Joe Trimble did one
Sure.
after his
Yeah.
5th year in the majors.
Well,
and Ben Epstein.
I don't ever remember anybody being in an argument with Yogi, seriously, except the time
Bill-
Jackie
Who was
Robinson-
the home plate umpire?
Bill Summer.
Yeah. That's the only
Yogi could elevate,
But that's
if
the
the
only
subject would
argument
come
he's
up
ever in.
of the slide,
Oh.
Robinson's slide, Yogi would still go up off his
Oh.
feet like he had the cartoon helicopter feet, and he's up like that, he was out! And it still bothered him, I mean, 20, 30 years
yeah.
later, if it
Really
came
bothered
up.
him. It bothered him. And it's too bad there was no instant replay, but Summers was a very short umpire, and Yogi maintains never saw the play, never saw it properly.
Well, for Yogi's 90th birthday party that Lindsay kind of master of ceremonies was, the Rachel Robinson, Jackie's widow, was here. And he talked to her, I guess, for 10 or 15 minutes. And I happened to be standing with Yogi right after that. And I said, Yogi, did you tell Rachel that Jackie was out? He said, of course, of course.
That's how they actually greet each other. When she walks up and she'll go say. Sharon Robinson, the daughter, and I do it all the time.
Right, oh, yeah.
It's a family tradition.
Didn't Yogi send a photo of the play to Obama?
Obama,
With the,
yeah.
with the
Yeah, they asked
inscription, Mr. President, he was out?
He was
Mr.
out.
President, he was out, yes. Exactly. Go ahead.
Lindsay, where do you stand with the Medal of Freedom? Is that still in the works?
As I just said to him, that's another reason I'm upset about that Medal of Freedom. He got a nice autograph, Obama did. I have no idea. They can, I think, they can give it posthumously, and I think historically it is announced in November and awarded in February. So I'm hoping that that's what happens. I can't imagine that they've completely forgotten about it. I certainly hope they haven't. I haven't let them. I've been tweeting, and I've been kind of a pain in the rear end by design, so. Yeah.
It's been a very impressive campaign. I didn't know this until tonight, but I already had this strong opinion of her as a stirrer of trouble because just from reading the stories of being able to put so much pressure on this poor guy trying to run the country, and she's throwing off all these notes to him. So anyway, well done.
Well done. Thank you.
You know that one of the nice things we're all, as the saying goes, we're all coming here to honor Yogi, but to put it in another perspective, I was a Dodger fan when I was a kid, and there's a certain level of terror that I have when I think about Billy Martin catching the pop-up and Tommy Henrik in 1949 with the home run off Newcomb in the first game. I mean, these were like assassins. One time, Tommy Henrik it was Old Timers game in the old stadium, and Steve Jacobson, my buddy, and I from Newsday were sitting in there typing away, and Henrik goes through from the press room to use the men's room, and he walks by, and Steve looks up at him and says, You ruined my life. The home run you hit in 1949, and I never could get back to my studies. I was never a good student after that. My life was, and Henrik looked at him. I don't think Henrik knew him too well. Henrik looked at him and said, tough shit. What were you going to be? What were you going to be, a doctor? Which is, classic on about 3 levels of whatever. So Yogi fits right in with that, because the home runs that he hit off Newcomb in 1956, I'm sure Newcomb still thinks about it. Just a wonderful, great man, still doing his thing with the Los Angeles Dodgers. But I know a lawyer who lives up a few towns up. He's a buddy of mine. He's from Queens, and now he moved to heaven to New Jersey. And he will remind me, he's about 10 years younger than me, and all during the year, for no reason, I'll look in my queue of emails, and there'll be one from my man Taxerman, and it'll say, what kind of hitter was that Yogala anyway? You think Nuke still thinks about this? And it's just, Christmas Day I could get one in my email, just to ruin my day. And so Yogi, as lovable as some of you may think, is like a shaman, or somebody used to bring bad luck to all old Brooklyn Dodger fans. Some nice guy.
The Brooklyn Dodgers also, there's a Brooklyn Dodgers Hall of Fame, which there's never really been a hall for the fame, but there is a Brooklyn Dodgers Hall of Fame, and there's been 3 opposing players in it: Stan Musial, Bobby Thompson, and Yogi Berra.
They did enough damage.
Okay. Well, go ahead, Peter.
Thought here. George mentioned humble celebrity or athlete ever known, all covering so many personalities. I agree that that's probably the I've been had the pleasure of being around. That struck me on the day funeral was when we got there were about 100 mounted police on motorcycles. One of the most moving spectacles I saw were older men, shirts or sweatshirts, in their front lawn. After the funeral, all of the police officers wait and lined up along the road going to the funeral. And I think as a Yankee fan, as a baseball fan, American, you agree that can you think of anyone or could you help us collectively remember a more beloved celebrity or of any kind of celebrity? I never really appreciated not one bad story.
I think Stan Musial might have approached that in St. Louis. George, right? Correct?
New Zealand, I mean, probably even in public life, there were people who retained more of their, Harry Truman, in my childhood, for a politician that still wore his flowery shirts and talked to the press in person and all of that. So on different levels, there are probably people that do stay, close to their roots. But I think Yogi didn't have any pretense, and he remained more like, one of the old guys on the hill in St. Louis that would, be drinking coffee and playing checkers or, whatever they did. He didn't move off that. He didn't get uptown. On the other hand, he was wise enough to marry somebody who made sure that he had a good life, that it all got organized and so on, so he could remain one with the popolo, man of the people. I think it wasn't anything he did on purpose. He just stayed pretty close to who he was. Probably there were other people that I couldn't think of, but certainly he'd be a prototype for it.
Well, I think today we also live in such a more polarized, culture than, certainly when Yogi was playing. I mean, Michael Jordan, I covered a lot of the NBA during the 80s and 90s. And Michael Jordan was an iconic athlete who once kind of got a little tongue-tied in Yogi's presence. He ran into him in the elevator at Yankee Stadium. But Jordan, was also such a corporate creation. Everything he did was designed to sell shoes. And so I think people were in awe of him, but I don't think, and if they loved him, it was because of how great he was at what he did, but I don't think they loved him per se as a human being. I think that Yogi wasn't the greatest ball player to ever live, but his records speak for themselves, and he certainly was he's a Hall of Fame catcher, tremendous statistics, and attached to one of the great winning machines of all time. So you add that to, I think, the approachability, and what George mentioned, no pretense, seemed his decency just kind of came shining through. I think you add all that together, and then again, I think the wonderful late in life time he got to spend back around the team. All those guys, Jeter, Posada, Mariano, they lit up when Yogi was around. It was plain to see. And so, it was such a great thing. Like I said before when I was joking about my son asking George to sign the ball, don't tell him, you're my son. But George did a great thing by coming here, and everyone benefited from it.
It's a different time also. Everybody, Jordan saying Republicans buy shoes also. I mean, this is not a political statement, but he knew that he wanted to, he wanted to be popular to everybody. He wanted to sell shoes to everybody. And I think in the early days, ball players were less educated, less articulate, less avaricious because there wasn't as much money to be made. I mean, the ball players we knew when you were playing, when you broke in, and certainly even when I was a kid, worked in stores. I mean, Roy Campanella worked in a store uptown. So did Jackie Robinson for a while. They did things because they needed the extra $1,000, and it made them humbled in a way that money didn't come easily. Nowadays, for being a little bit slicker, having a little bit more of an image, I think you sacrifice some of the spontaneity. And if you don't, you're probably not going to make any of the hold on to your money or your place in life anyway. But Yogi, Yogi Luck or Yogi Design or whatever, he lived a really good life, and I'm probably, I'm just guessing. I'd like to think, and even financially living in a nice town and living well, but that I don't think he stretched for himself. I mean, he had his Yoo-hoo, he did his commercials. Aflac was an amazing commercial, if you think about it, because there's the same guy sitting around a barbershop and the duck and all of this, but it was Yogi. He didn't have to pretend to be somebody else. Nowadays, these guys are all, and some of the women too, are polished and honed to be something that, they are, but they're something different from what they might have been.
I guess my thought real just to add to that is that you talked earlier about having Bill as a friend talking about him, all enabled him to be so bigger than life. But I don't think success or his greatness would have been sustained if it wasn't for when the world came out and born his death. I think that's the takeaway story for me is that whatever we saw externally, all that greatness, this legacy would not have been maintained if it wasn't for just his pure humility.
I will say this, that, like I mentioned before about Jordan in terms of his performance, that I think certain athletes could approach Yogi's level in certain aspects of, of the puzzle that gets put together for the complete human being and athlete. Jeter certainly is universally respected. We saw that even in the, the corporate Nike thing where John Lester was tipping his cap to him. But I would say the one guy, and Ron Guidry would brought up this guy's name, when comparing him a little bit to Yogi, was Mariano Rivera. Because not only was he absolutely fantastic at what he did, but I don't think you would find anyone around baseball, and even people who dislike the Yankees, who would have anything negative to say about Mariano. Very considered by just about everyone as a very decent human being, caring, philanthropic, all the things that we like to think about, that we know about Yogi as well. Whereas Derek Jeter, a lot of people feel, they certainly respect him, and he's an example of playing the game the right way. Maybe the great firewall, the main firewall in this whole era of steroids. I've heard many young people say, if I ever found out that Derek Jeter took steroids, I'd never watch another baseball game again. But at the same time, often, what was often said about Derek is that he's kind of aloof, can't get close to him, doesn't give of himself. You don't know who the genuine Jeter really is. So I guess if anybody, if any one name would come to mind, it might be Mariano Rivera.
I think if he had lived longer, Yale Hodges might have approached the same stature that Yogi has.
Especially as manager of the Mets as well.
Exactly. If he had stayed with the Mets and they had won, and he had been a manager there for a long time, because he was the same type of person.
Who else I always think if he lived longer is Clemente.
Roberto Clemente, I think.
Well, we're Mount Rushmore of great people. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for helping us honor our man once again. Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys mind signing copies of books if people want them signed?
Sure.